Thanks very much, everyone, for coming out, and a big thank you to PALS for hosting this and being so supportive of my book. It's really an honor for me to be here. I never lived in Portland or spent a lot of time here, but I have been through here in the past and wandered the labyrinth of PALS. So it's really means a lot to me to get to be up here tonight. I'm going to talk a little bit about why I went to Iraq, which is how this book was born. And I'll have a question and answer session and read some from the book along the way as well. I want to start in more present tense, though, and begin by talking about one of the recent generals in what's now become a long string of generals who have retired, and then incredibly, after they retire from serving in whatever positions of supporting and running this illegal, immoral war and occupation, once they retire, this interesting phenomena happens. It seems as though their testicles drop. So the individual with his newfound testicles I'd like to start with is a former top U.S. general who was the CENTCOM commander. CENTCOM is Central Command, the U.S. headquarters for the military in the Middle East in Doha, Qatar. And former CENTCOM Commander General John Abizaid, speaking at Stanford University, where he's now a member of the Hoover Institute there, which many people probably are familiar with that. Big shocker. He was speaking there the middle of last month about the Iraq War, and he said, quote, "Of course it's about oil. We can't really deny that." He went on to say, "We've treated the Arab world as a collection of big gas stations. Our message to them is, guys, keep your pumps open, price is low, be nice to the Israelis, and you can do whatever you want out back." He said on October the 31st, more recently, speaking at Carnegie Mellon University, that it may well be 50 years before the U.S. leaves the Middle East. It was roughly a month after, before he had made that first comment, that even the former Federal Reserve Chair, Alan Greenspan, wrote, quote, "The Iraq War is largely about oil." So here we are approaching the 5th year anniversary of the invasion, and it's become commonplace now, almost in vogue, for retired generals, retired administration officials to come out and denounce the occupation or be critical of it, at least to the extent of discussing how it should be run differently, etc. I want to back up now to the time period when the propaganda campaign for the invasion was launched. I want to take us back to September 6, 2002. Then the White House Chief of Staff, Andrew Card, when speaking about the PR campaign for the Iraq War, told reporters, quote, "From a marketing point of view, you don't introduce new products in August." And with few exceptions, I really didn't hear any mainstream media critique, dissent, asking questions like, is it really appropriate for a White House Chief of Staff to be discussing PR campaigns and war in the same sentence? I was outraged. I think probably most people in this room tonight were outraged. And it was really because this was just the very beginning. It got worse, because launching a PR campaign for war is exactly what Andrew Card did. And as I move through this, think about present tense. This September, a different PR campaign for a new war was also launched with staunch backing from the American Heritage Foundation, a neoconservative think tank. And here we are today with the rhetoric continuing. But I'll get back to that a little bit later. So that was on September 6th when Andrew Card said that. The very next day, on September 7th, George Bush and Tony Blair stood together at Camp David and declared that they had evidence from a report published by the UN International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, that showed that Iraq was 6 months away from building nuclear weapons. What made it particularly outrageous was the fact that no such IAEA report existed. And again, where was the corporate media? Where were the journalists that were asking Mr. Bush or Mr. Blair or some of their underlings to provide that IAEA report or any other evidence that would support their claims of Iraq about to get nuclear weapons or already having WMDs, links to 9/11, etc.? Where were the journalists? Where were the hard questions? And again, with very, very few exceptions in the mainstream, they weren't there. Instead, they were just announcing these claims without questioning, which is not journalism, that's propaganda. The very next day, instead of, if journalists were really doing their job, the next day on the leading newspapers, the cover story should have been Bush and Blair make preposterous, baseless claim with no evidence of an IAEA report that does not exist. If journalists were really doing their job, that should have been the lead story. Instead, the very next day, September 8, 2002, the cover story, the front page story on the New York Times, co-authored by Judith Miller and Michael Gordon of WMD notoriety, Michael Gordon still working for the Times, of course, in which they proudly quoted their favorite sources. This one, a Bush administration official, anonymous of course, as saying, quote, "Iraq has stepped up its quest for nuclear weapons and has embarked on a worldwide hunt for materials to make an atomic bomb." And again, no questioning whatsoever of where's the evidence, let's have the hard evidence, show us something. If you're going to take the country into war against another country, things like evidence would be particularly important. But again, it wasn't there. And I was completely outraged and simultaneously baffled that, with few exceptions again, the corporate media was silenced instead of doing the job as journalists should do and asking the hard questions. Instead, it was, as journalist John Pilger has described that situation, along with others, instead of being real journalism, what the mainstream media was doing was propaganda disguised as journalism. So for me, that was my red line. I was living in Anchorage, Alaska. I was working summers up on Denali, guiding and then volunteering doing rescues for the National Park Service up there. And I've always loved to write. I had done some freelance journalism, but for me, I figured, you know, that's if we're going to be taken into a war, and if this is the state of our media today, then something has to be done. And I didn't know what else to do. I was frustrated. I was completely outraged. I wasn't sleeping well once the war launched. I was glued to foreign media to find out what was happening, what was being done. And I decided one thing I could do was I could go over and see for myself what was happening, and I could write about that. So I went over to Iraq. I saved a couple of $1,000s. And I'm just sharing this story because I'm not a professional journalist. I didn't go to J school, all the stuff that you're supposed to do to become a so-called professional journalist. And I share all this because if anyone here thinks you can't make a difference, think again. So I went into Iraq my first trip on, I got there November 24th, 2003, so about 7 months after the fall of Baghdad. And I hit the ground, and within 72 hours I was hearing stories of torture, not just from Abu Ghraib, but from military detention facilities in the north of Baghdad, down in the south, industrial scale torture as policy. Stories, again, not just from Abu Ghraib, but sexual humiliation, dogs being used, electricity, sleep deprivation, etc. And I was on the ground 72 hours, and I was hearing these stories all over the streets of Baghdad. But on my 5th day there, on November 29th, up in Samara, I heard of another story that perked my interest as well. And the U.S. military announced that they had a patrol in downtown Samara that came under attack from a huge contingent of Saddam's Fedayeen. Saddam's Fedayeen were basically his shock troops, his special forces. And the military claim seemed odd because there had never up until that date, nor has there been ever after that date, been a uniform organized contingent of his military launch an attack on any of the occupation forces, or anyone else for that matter. So it smelled. And it smelled even more because the military claimed that the patrol came under attack, they fought back valiantly, and they killed 48 Fedayeen. And then overnight, another report came out the next day that said the number was 54 killed, not 48. And again, there was no evidence given for this whatsoever. So it seemed really peculiar. So a couple of friends and I and an interpreter took a car up to Samara, about an hour and a half north of Baghdad. And it made sense to us that, well, evidence is important, and if the military is going to make this claim, there must be a lot of bodies in the morgue. So we went to Samara General Hospital and spoke with doctors, spoke with wounded people there. There were many wounded people from gunshot wounds in the hospital. And we went to the mortician, and we were shown 8 bodies, and they were all civilians. And the stories that the doctors told us and everyone that we interviewed in the hospital bids, from little kids on up to men to women, the story was that a U.S. patrol was in downtown Samara. It was attacked by a group of maybe 2 or 3 resistance fighters, and then they fled, as they usually do, as is the nature of guerrilla war. And then the military patrol basically went berserk and started shooting up downtown Samara, and these are the 8 civilians that were killed. 2 of them were Iranian pilgrims, because once the borders opened up after Saddam was removed, the Shrine of Al-Askari is in Samara, otherwise known as the Golden Mosque, which was exploded in February '06. The 2 Iranian pilgrims were visiting this very sacred Shia shrine, and then the other 6 bodies were residents from Samara. And an interesting thing happened then. We went and interviewed a leading tribal leader in the area, and he said the same story. He said, if there are all these bodies, as the military claims, let's see them. If there's 54 dead at Fedayeen, where did they go? Where are the bodies? Did the Americans take them in their tanks? Are they flying? Just show us the bodies. And so after interviewing him, we decided to go down to the scene of the attack in downtown Samara. And to give you an idea of how dangerous the situation became for journalists as a direct result of the corporate media propaganda efforts, the scene was already set when we arrived, so that what had happened was a day or 2 before we got there, there were some mainstream journalists that showed up with their news cameras, BBC, NBC, and I think a couple of others, and they interviewed people, put them on tape, filmed them, and then went back to Baghdad, and instead of showing any of that footage, they just regurgitated the military side of the story. So it was a loaded situation when we showed up, and it made it that much more dangerous for us. And so when we started talking to people, needless to say, they were very, very upset at us for being there, and that's the context for this first bit that I'd like to read you. We were surrounded by throngs of nervous and very angry Samara residents when we revisited the scene of the attack. A rusty old taxi driving by slowed, and a man yelled at us out the window. All the media is not telling the truth. They are lying, all of them. Don't talk to them. I did so many interviews with the media, and nobody is telling my truth. Nobody has reported what I told them. Why should you even talk to them? They are lying all the time, so don't talk to them. I stood near a building riddled with bullets and spoke with people who crowded around, anxiously waiting to tell their story. Shell casings littered the ground near the wall of a home. A man in his early 40s exclaimed with his hands in the air, "If the Americans can shoot every child walking in the street, it means the end of this planet." In just 1 week, I had already become familiar with the hands-in-air gesture made by frustrated and shocked Iraqis. To me, it signified the despair that was spreading across the country, a plea to anything or anyone who would listen. Another man showed me a parked car scarred with 112 bullets. He told of a U.S. soldier who had gone crazy and fired his weapon everywhere, even up at the sky at electrical wires running above the street. 2 of the wires had been shot through and were crudely spliced back together. They shot a lot of bullets to cut these wires, he said. The American soldier was laughing and shooting the wires. Are they Fedayeen wires? Were the wires attacking the Americans? He was laughing like a crazy man. Another man approached me with the 2 children of his brother killed by U.S. gunfire by his side. This little boy and girl, their father was shot by the Americans. Who will take care of this family? Who will watch over these children? Who will feed them now? Who? Why did they kill my brother? What is the reason? Nobody told me. He was a truck driver. What is his crime? Why did they shoot him? They shot him with 150 bullets. Did they kill him just because they wanted to shoot a man? That's it? This is the reason? Why didn't anyone talk to me and tell me why they have killed my brother? Is killing people a normal thing now, happening every day? This is our future? This is the future that the United States promised Iraq? That incident and variations of that incident I saw repeated over and over and over throughout a total of 8 months I would spend reporting inside of Iraq. And it sheds light on why and how the total number of Iraqis killed so far is astronomically high. There's been only two credible scientific studies to date to tally the excess deaths generated by the invasion and occupation. They were both done by doctors and scientists from Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Health in conjunction with their colleagues at Mustansiriya University in Baghdad. And they were both published in a peer-reviewed medical journal in Britain called the Lancet, and so it's otherwise known as the Lancet Report. The first was released in October 2004, and more recently, their survey, the groundwork for which was conducted in July 2005, published in the Lancet on October of 2006. And that report found 655,000 Iraqis, or 2.5% of the entire population of the country, have been killed as a direct result of the US-led invasion and occupation of Iraq. Comparable casualties in our country, if we extrapolated those numbers to make a comparison, if that percentage of people in our country had been killed, that would mean that every person in Atlanta, Denver, Boston, Seattle, Milwaukee, Fort Worth, Baltimore, San Francisco, Dallas, and Philadelphia would be dead. Every single person. Since then, another group called Just Foreign Policy, extrapolating data from the media from the time that study, the legwork for that study was concluded in July 2005. They now estimate that the number is well over 1 million Iraqis. It's almost 1,100,000 last I checked. And of course, there's never been a study on the number of wounded Iraqis, but for example, for every American soldier that's killed in Iraq, there's an average of 10 wounded. So being very conservative, let's say there's 3 million wounded Iraqis. Something I've checked out with medical workers in Iraq, and they say, yeah, that's extremely conservative, but you could say that. So to give you an idea of how catastrophic the occupation has become today, the total population of Iraq when the invasion was launched in March '03 was roughly 27 million people. Today it's under 23 million. Of those 23 million, roughly 3 million Iraqis are internally displaced peoples, IDPs, i.e. refugees, inside their own country. Another 3 million have fled the country altogether. 3 million are wounded, and 4 million are in need of emergency care, according to an Oxfam International report released this last July. Meaning if they don't get access to safe drinking water, food, and access to medical care, then they're at risk for their lives, in addition to 1 million dead. That means 14 million people, over half the total population of the country, are either refugees, wounded, in dire need of emergency care, or dead. You could say that. I want to shift now and talk about Fallujah. I spent a lot of time on this in the book because, in my opinion, it was probably the largest scale evidence of the brutality of the occupation. The context for this next bit that I'd like to read, it's about the April siege of Fallujah, the first siege. And if you watch the corporate media, then year zero, day zero, for everything about Fallujah started on March 31st, 2004, the day when 4 Blackwater, USA mercenaries were killed and the horrible things done to their bodies in Fallujah. But there's a little bit more context to the story than just that. We all know now, just as an aside, with all the Blackwater information that's been in the news, as it should be, this is a private contractor company, very, very close links to the Bush administration. CEO Eric Prince has donated hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars to the Bush administration, the Republican Party. That's why, of course, the State Department has happily granted them immunity over the last week for all of their contractors, but they've already had it in Iraq anyhow since the very beginning of the occupation. But my point is that these contractors had been operating in Fallujah for many months because the U.S. military had been unable to. If we back up a little bit, I want to start with saying that despite the mainstream media propaganda that surrounded the events of March 31st, 2004, that portrayed the entire city as bloodthirsty savages, Saddam loyalists, Saddam holdouts, Fallujah is a very pro-Saddam city. The reality is that Saddam Hussein never could control Fallujah. The people there despised his regime, despite the fact that there were a number of his high-ranking intelligence officers living in the city. He did not have support in the city, as evidenced by the fact that when the U.S. invaded Iraq and they rolled into Fallujah, they were not attacked. Not to say they were welcomed with rose petals, they weren't, but they weren't attacked. And instead, tribal leaders and religious leaders in the city put forth a very pro-U.S. shake to work within the Coalition Provisional Authority. People of the city wanted things to improve. They wanted a better life. They were happy that Saddam was gone. But problems began in the city very early on in the occupation. Less than 3 weeks after the fall of Baghdad, on April 9, 03 was when Baghdad fell. On April 29, in Fallujah, U.S. military personnel were occupying a school, and mostly parents and relatives of the children of that school held a demonstration, a large 300-400 people strong demonstration across the street outside of that school. And they were unarmed, it was peaceful, and they were open fired upon by soldiers in the school, and 17 people were killed. Later on, a Human Rights Watch report on the incident and a ballistics report found no evidence to support the military claims that they had taken any fire whatsoever from the demonstration, i.e. no U.S. military personnel were wounded or dead. There was no evidence of any bullet pock marks in the school whatsoever, but of course the walls and the houses behind the demonstrator were riddled with bullets. Another demonstration a few days later about that incident was also open fired on, and several more Iraqis were killed. Thus, the resistance was born in Fallujah. It quickly grew. It was a very powerful resistance, and by the time March rolled around, the U.S. military couldn't run patrols in the city for 30 minutes or more without it being attacked. So every once in a while they'd push a big armored column into the city, it'd get hammered, and they'd pull it back out. So they resorted to mercenaries like Blackwater USA and other companies. And these people were going into the city, and there'd been reports coming out of the city for months that they were carrying out executions, abductions, looting, this type of thing. So we're getting a little closer to March 31, but before I go there, another very important piece of this puzzle is that on March 22nd, 9 days before the Blackwater guys were killed in Gaza, the Israeli military assassinated Sheikh Yassin, the spiritual leader of Hamas. And so when the Blackwater personnel were attacked on March 31, the people that did it, it was a small group. They distributed leaflets at the scene that said, this was done, we are the Sheikh Yassin Revenge Brigade. This is done in retaliation for what the Israeli military did in Gaza recently. So it's an important thing to note, as has always been the case through the occupation, that events happening in Palestine/Israel/occupied territories, every time a big event happens there, it sends shockwaves across the Middle East. And so one could argue that the Fallujah siege occurred in large part because of actions of the Israeli military in Gaza. So they're killed. The horrible things were done to their body. We're all familiar with those photos and that footage. The whole city is portrayed as barbarians. If you listen to the mainstream media, it was just like as though the entire city took place in the attack, and everyone there just wants to do nothing else than hack up bodies and drag them behind cars and hang them from bridges. And in reality, what wasn't broadcast by the mainstream media was that all of the religious leaders of the city staunchly denounced what was done to the bodies of the Blackwater mercenaries. And they told the U.S. military commander in charge of the city, look, if you give us some time, we'll find these people and we'll bring them to you, because we don't want them in our city either, because those actions are against Islam. But we didn't hear about that. And instead, the whole city was demonized, and there was a massive propaganda campaign that was launched on March 31 up until April 4, that short window of time, because the April siege began on April 4. And in those few days, for example, the New York Times didn't call these men mercenaries. On the outside, they called them armed contractors or security contractors, some. But in the New York Times alone, in that short window of time, they referred to them as American civilians 25 times. Other major newspapers around the states followed suit. The San Francisco Chronicle, the Washington Post, the Chicago Tribune, just to name a few. Over 10 times, every single one of those papers called them American civilians. Several of them wrote, the Blackwater security contractors were conducting food delivery in the Fallujah area, just to give you an idea. Also, what wasn't reported is that the U.S. military commander in charge of Fallujah did not want to have the whole city attacked. Instead, he was of the mindset that, well, we have these small token construction projects going on. We are working on some schools, some small irrigation projects. We're doing this to earn the trust and build rapport between us and the people of the city. It's very slow, and this is obviously a huge setback, but we feel like we're making a little bit of progress. We want to keep going down that road. So it's important to note that the order to siege the entire city came against the wishes of the military commanders on the ground that knew better, i.e. shades of the initial invasion of Iraq itself. The order came directly from the White House. And again, when we look at the Blackwater situation with all the new information that's come to light in the last weeks, thanks in large part to Jeremy Scahill and his great book about Blackwater and his tracking the situation, we have a more clear idea today as to why that order came directly from the White House, because this favored private mercenary company had been attacked and made to look very, very bad. So the order was given to siege the city, and a very huge siege commenced, but the military was unable to really push very far inside the city. Very fierce fighting, and when I came into Baghdad on April 4, that trip, the day that the city was sealed, and we were hearing, as refugees streamed out of the city and came down into Baghdad, we were hearing horror stories. Mass civilian casualties, ambulances being targeted, horrible war crimes being carried out, cluster bombs being used. And so an opportunity presented itself where me and a few friends had the chance to go into the city. And that opportunity was an Iraqi NGO in Baghdad had organized a bus to go into the city and carry in humanitarian supplies. There were reports that the city was largely sealed, and it was difficult to get medical supplies in and out, and clinics, of course, were in dire need of just basic things like gauze and rubber gloves and blankets and clean water. So this NGO organized a bus to go in, and I decided to go. And we chose April 9 as the day to go in because this was the day that the military announced that there was a ceasefire as there were negotiations going on. And of course that was broadcast by the mainstream media back here. But when we went in on April 9th, we saw instead fighter jets dropping bombs in different parts of the city, helicopters strafing other parts of the city. It was anything but a ceasefire. And that's the context for this next bit that I'd like to read you. We rolled toward the one small clinic where we were to deliver our medical supplies. The small clinic was managed by Maki al-Nazal, who was hired just 4 days ago. He was not a doctor. The other makeshift clinic in Fallujah was in a mechanic's garage. He had barely slept in the past week, nor had any of the doctors at the small clinic. Originally, the clinic had just 3 doctors, but since the U.S. military bombed one of the hospitals and were currently sniping at people as they attempted to enter or exit the main hospital, effectively there were only these 2 small clinics treating the entire city. The boxes of medical supplies we brought into the clinic were torn open immediately by the desperate doctors. A woman entered, slapping her chest and face, and wailing as her husband carried in the dying body of her little boy. Blood was trickling off one of his arms, which dangled out of his father's arms. Thus began my witnessing of an endless stream of women and children who had been shot by U.S. soldiers and were now being raced into the dirty clinic, the cars speeding over the curb out front, and weeping family members carrying in their wounded. One 18-year-old girl had been shot through the neck. She was making breathy, gurgling noises as the doctors frantically worked on her amid her muffled moaning. Flies dodged the working hands of doctors to return to the patches of her vomit that stained her black abaya. Her younger brother, a small child of 10 with a gunshot wound in his head from a Marine sniper, his eyes glazed and staring into space, continually vomited as the doctors raced to save his life while family members cried behind me. The Americans cut our electricity days ago, so we cannot vacuum the vomit from his throat, a furious doctor tells me. They were both loaded into an ambulance and rushed toward Baghdad, only to die en route. Another small child lay on a blood-spattered bed, also shot by a sniper. The boy's grandmother lay nearby, shot as she was attempting to carry children from their home and flee the city. She lay on a bed dying, still clutching a bloodied white surrender flag. Hundreds of families were trapped in their homes, terrorized by U.S. snipers shooting from rooftops and minarets of moss whenever they saw someone move past a window. Blood bags were being kept in a food refrigerator, warmed under running water before being given to patients. There were no anesthetics. The lights went out as the generator ran dry of fuel, so the doctors, who had been working for days on end, worked by light provided by men holding up cigarette lighters or flashlights as the sun set. Needless to say, there was no air conditioning inside the steamy clinic. One victim of the U.S. military aggression after another was brought into the clinic, nearly all of them women and children, carried by weeping family members. Those who had not been hit by bombs from warplanes had been shot by U.S. snipers. The one functioning ambulance left at this clinic sat outside with bullet holes in the sides and a small group of shots right on the driver's side of the windshield. The driver, his head bandaged from being grazed by the bullet of the sniper, refused to go collect any more of the dead and wounded. Standing near the ambulance in frustration, Maki told us, "They shot the ambulance and they shot the driver after they checked his car, inspected his car, and knew that he was carrying nothing. Then they shot him, and then they shot the ambulance. And now I have no ambulance to evacuate more than 20 wounded people. I don't know who is doing this and why he is doing this. This is terrible. This has never happened before. And I don't know who to call because it seems that nobody is listening." The stream of patients slowed to a sporadic influx as night fell. Maki sat with me as we shared cigarettes in a small office in the rear of the clinic. "For all my life I believed in American democracy," he told me with an exhausted voice. "For 47 years I had accepted the illusion of Europe and the United States being good for the world, the carriers of freedom and democracy. Now I see that it took me 47 years to wake up to the horrible truth. They are not here to bring anything like democracy or freedom." Now I see it has all been lies. The Americans don't give a damn about democracy or human rights. They are worse than even Saddam. I asked him if he minded if I quoted him with his name. What are they going to do to me that they haven't already done here, he said. That siege ended, and I went back into the city several times in May. And after I interviewed doctors at Fallujah General Hospital, I was told that 736 people died in that siege, and that they estimated 60% of them were civilians. The city then remained unoccupied for 6 months. It was the only unoccupied city in the country. And then that set the stage for November, right after Bush remained in office, after the elections, in quotes, here in 2004. Within days of that happening, on November 8th, the siege of the city, the second siege, titled Operation Phantom Fury, was launched. And at the end of that siege, which was under the guise, again, if you watch corporate media for that siege, I think the line went something like, Jordanian terrorist Abu Musab al-Zarqawi had taken control of the city. One military commander in the area described it as a hostage intervention operation. There's no evidence to support anywhere that Zarqawi ever went inside the city. And I can speak from firsthand experience that he would not have been welcome there had he tried. Nevertheless, the city was attacked, very, very huge and fierce siege, and at the end of it, over 100 U.S. soldiers were killed, nearly 1,000 wounded, and later on an Iraqi NGO in the city estimated that approximately 5,000 people in the city died during that siege. To this day, there are entire neighborhoods of Fallujah that do not have running water or electricity, and the city even has higher unemployment rate than the rest of Iraq at about 80%. The rest of Iraq, the unemployment rate's between 60 and 70% now. There was so much going on that spring, March, April, May, June of '04. We had Muqtada al-Sadr had launched an uprising against U.S. forces. We had Fallujah, of course, which I just spoke about. And so it got confusing at times, and so to get clarity, I fortunately had found a senior political scientist at Baghdad University who was very, very astute, and it was oftentimes very clarifying to go talk with him and interview him to get his take on what was happening. And that's the context for this next short bit that I'd like to read when myself and my main interpreter in Iraq, his name is Harb, decided to go visit him. One day as we neared the end of April, Harb drove me to the other side of his neighborhood of Al-Adhamiyah in Baghdad. The setting sun was bathing the nearby groves of date palms in a dark orange when we pulled in front of the old but elegant home of Dr. Wamid Omar Nathmi on the banks of the Tigris River, directly across from the sprawling green zone. We were escorted into his sitting room by one of his sons before Dr. Nathmi entered. The old stately professor greeted us formally, then immediately lit a cigarette and engaged Harb in some small talk in Arabic before getting to my questions. An outspoken critic of the former regime, Dr. Nathmi was truly a nationalist and had always worked for the Iraqi people, rather than any particular sect or political party. It quickly became apparent to me that he had no qualms about criticizing U.S. policy. Quote, "Once you abide by the policy of the USA, you're not a terrorist anymore. In 1991, Syria was not a terrorist because they supported the war against Iraq. Syria opposed the recent invasion, so now they are a terrorist state," he explained. When I asked what he thought about the Bush administration's claim that Iraq was the front line of the so-called war on terror, he replied, "Here, one would have to distinguish between terrorism and resistance. Terror was unseen here before the invasion. In Fallujah, it is not terrorism, it is resistance." We spoke of U.S. policy throughout the Middle East. When I asked the professor about Palestine, he said, the crimes against humanity in Palestine are shown daily on the television. This does not indicate that the current U.S. administration is committed to democracy or human rights. How can the United States, a war criminal in Palestine, be accepted as a state builder in Iraq? We had a lengthy discussion on the reality in Iraq, where more and more Iraqis had long since woken up to the fact that the true U.S. agenda was not for their liberation or benefit, but for the oil and its own geostrategic military position. The Americans' war against Iraq is over, he told me. Now we have the war of Iraq against America. It is a war of Iraqis fighting for their country, their homes, their money, and their lives. Before I prepare to close, I'd like to read one more thing because it's very instructive about what's happening to U.S. soldiers serving in Iraq today, which is very similar to what happened to U.S. soldiers serving in Vietnam. And I'd like to do this by reading some writing of a very famous psychiatrist. His name is Robert J. Lifton. And Robert J. Lifton is famous as he is and has done so much amazing work because he's done deep, lengthy investigations into how human beings become capable of carrying out atrocities against other human beings. He, for example, did studies on how did the SS do the things they did during the Holocaust. How did U.S. soldiers in combat in Vietnam do the things they did, like My Lai, and come back home with necklaces of chopped off ears of Viet Cong they had killed and thought that that was normal, and then be surprised when people back here were horrified. And so Robert J. Lifton started to do studies. He played an integral role in coming up with the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder and continues to write about the situation in Iraq from that experience. In an article titled Conditions of Atrocity, Robert J. Lifton cited both My Lai and the Iraqi prison of Abu Ghraib as examples of what he called, and these are his words, atrocity-producing situations, so structured psychologically and militarily that ordinary people, men or women no better or worse than you or I, can regularly commit atrocities. In Vietnam, that structure included free fire zones, areas in which soldiers were encouraged to fire at virtually anyone, body counts, with a breakdown in the distinction between combatants and civilians, and competition among commanders for the best statistics, and the emotional state of U.S. soldiers as they struggled with angry grief over buddies killed by invisible adversaries and with a desperate need to identify some enemy. This kind of atrocity-producing situation surely occurs in some degree in all wars, including World War II, our last so-called good war. But a counterinsurgency war in a hostile setting, especially when driven by profound ideological distortions, is particularly prone to sustained atrocity, all the more so when it becomes an occupation. Before I get into the question and answer session, I'd like to end on a little bit of a positive note to lower the chances of risk cutting when people leave the room. This is a poem by poet and author Marge Piercy. It's called The Low Road. What can they do to you? Whatever they want. They can set you up. They can bust you. They can break your fingers. They can burn your brain with electricity, blur you with drugs till you can't walk, can't remember. They can take your child, wall up your lover. They can do anything you can't stop them from doing. How can you stop them? Alone you can fight, you can refuse, you can take what revenge you can, but they roll over you. But two people fighting back to back can cut through a mob. A snake dancing file can break a cordon. An army can meet an army. Two people can keep each other sane, can give support, conviction, love, massage, hope, sex. Three people are a delegation, a committee, a wedge. With four, you can play bridge and start an organization. With six, you can rent a whole house, eat pie for dinner with no seconds, and hold a fundraising party. A dozen make a demonstration. 100 fill a hall. 1,000 have solidarity in your own newsletter. 10,000 power in your own paper. 100,000, your own media. 10 million, your own country. It goes on one at a time. It starts when you care to act. It starts when you do it again after they said no. It starts when you say we and know who you mean, and each day you mean one more. Thank you.
You've been listening to a presentation by Dahr Jamail, speaking about his recent book, Beyond the Green Zone, Dispatches from an Unembedded Journalist in Occupied Iraq. In a moment, we'll return to the questions from the audience. Dahr Jamail is a former wilderness mountain guide and rescue ranger. In 2003, he traveled to occupied Iraq to report on events, originally sending email dispatches back to family, friends, and acquaintances, his reports reaching perhaps 130 people, mostly in Alaska. Today he writes for the Interpress Service, the Asia Times, and many other outlets. His reports have appeared in The Nation, The Sunday Herald, Islam Online, The Guardian, Foreign Policy in Focus, and The Independent. To find out more about Dahr Jamail and his work, please visit his website, Dahr Jamail's Mideast Dispatches, at www.dahrjamailiraq.com. And now we return to Dahr Jamail, talking about his new book, Beyond the Green Zone, Dispatches from an Unembedded Journalist in Occupied Iraq.
We've got time for Q&A. I'm gonna try to head off what's usually the first, second, or third question I'm always asked, which is, what can we do, or what should we do? The first thing I'd like to point out is that I think I like that poem so much for a lot of reasons, but one of them is the theme of organizing locally and building community, which in a place like Portland I know is not a new topic for most of you here. But it's my opinion that the mainstream anti-war movement in the United States is in very, very big trouble today. They've proven themselves basically completely ineffective at doing anything. For example, Judith LeBlanc, United for Peace and Justice national co-chair, wrote in People's Weekly World, following the sweeping victory of the Democrats in the midterm elections here in 2006, that this was seen as a vindication of United for Peace and Justice's strategy of, quote, building a bipartisan peace bloc in Congress that can set the date for troops withdrawal and force Bush and the Pentagon to end the occupation, end quote. Similarly, Nancy Pelosi, quote, we have to make responsible decisions in the Congress that are not driven by the dissatisfaction of anybody who wants the war to end tomorrow. But there are some groups that I'd like to point out that I feel are in a very, very exciting stage of really starting to lift off and will play an integral role in ending the occupation. In Vietnam, one of the most important things that happened was a GI resistance movement, and that basically led to a situation where at the end of the Vietnam War, soldiers on the ground, half the soldiers were not following orders. It made it completely untenable for the administration here to continue to try to fight a war with a completely broken military that was refusing orders. That, of course, was happening at the same time as a fierce Vietnamese resistance on the ground and a large movement of people here backing that GI resistance movement and basically covering their shoes as they chose to refuse orders and supporting them as they took that stand. That same thing is happening now. It's not getting any coverage. There's a group called Iraq Veterans Against the War. Their membership's growing. They're getting between 10 and 15 new members every single week. It's doubled every single year since they formed. It might well triple this year. This group, their fastest growing segment of their population is active duty soldiers. I did a story recently for Interpress Service because I was up in New York at Fort Drum, where the 10th Mountain Division is, And I was interviewing a lot of soldiers, several of them active duty, and they were telling me things that really shocked me because I hadn't heard it. One of them said, we were getting attacked so much over there, and he got back about a year ago. He was in the Abu Ghraib city and Fallujah area of central Iraq. He said, we were getting attacked so much that we decided that it was foolish to keep running patrols. They weren't bringing any more security to the Iraqi people, and we all knew very well that our commander, for example, was sending us out on these patrols because he would get a medal even if he wasn't with us if his platoon was attacked. And so we had enough of that. So we started basically going out to the end of our patrol route. We'd find a big, nice open field, ideally with some date palms. We'd pull our Humvees up and we'd sit, our unarmored Humvees up, and we'd sit there and we'd smoke cigarettes and we'd drink soda and we'd listen to music and pretend. And every hour we would call back to base and say, yep, we're doing weapons, we're searching for weapons caches in this field and it's going great. Talk to you in another hour. And he said, we were doing that every other day. I interviewed another soldier who was in a completely different part of Iraq at a completely different time of the occupation. Same thing. He's like, oh yeah, everybody was doing that. That's not news. And then I learned that they were called search and avoid missions. So my point is, GI resistance is already happening on the ground. It's already happening here. We have people like Aaron Watada. Most of you have probably heard that name before. So something you can do, support IVAW, ivaw.org. Is there anyone here from IVAW tonight? Okay. Well, you can go to that website. They need money. They need support. If you don't have money, there's plenty of other things you can do to help support them. Another integral group, I think, is Veterans for Peace. They again are part of that, the tip of that spear. They have legitimacy that the rest of us don't have, and also need support. And I think are already playing a critical role towards ending the occupation. And of course, organizing locally, as you're already doing here at Portland, is absolutely critical, because the idea that some political candidate or some big figure on the left in the anti-war movement is going to rise up and end this situation is a pipe dream. It's just not going to happen. But what I'm seeing as I go around on my book tour, everywhere I go, speaking to very full houses, people are fed up, they've had enough, and I'm meeting people everywhere I go doing amazing, incredible work and causing change and supporting these GI resistors and doing things in their communities to end this occupation. And my point is that we have a corporate media today in this country that is in a self-described crisis. They are dying like a dinosaur, and I think it's our job to help them die. While building the alternative, and that's happening. So whether it's the media or whether it's GI resistance movement, the thing is it is happening, and the revolution will not be televised, but especially by the corporate media.
There are a group of us in Portland that are working to bring an Iraqi child injured in the war to Portland for medical care that she or he can't get in Iraq because of the war. Anyone interested in that effort, please see me afterwards. I have a lot of information on it. The key thing we need right now is a hospital willing to provide free care if anybody has those connections. See me afterwards.
Thank you.
We're working with No More Victims.
NoMoreVictims.org. Fantastic group. Cole Miller out of LA started it, got it rolling. There's another thing that can be done.
Repeat the question.
Yeah, I'll repeat the question. He wants to know how I went from working in the mountains in Alaska to reporting in Iraq as a reporter. I basically put my email address on an independent media center listserv in Beirut, and it's now gone under, I think. But they had a guy in Baghdad blogging, and I wrote him. He was doing amazing work, and I wrote him and I said, I'm an American citizen, I want to come over. I've never done this, I've never been to the Middle East, I just want to come over and do what you're doing. so that then when I come back home after my money runs out, I'll be able to sleep a little bit better at night. That was my plan. And I wrote him and said, how do I get in? And he said, he basically wrote me kind of a rough, Lonely Planet-esque type of guide of how to come into Iraq under occupation. And so he said, go to this hotel in Amman, stay there, you can hire a car to go into Baghdad, $60 for a seat, go on in, go to this hotel in Baghdad, and here's a couple of contacts. And so I bought a ticket. I had a couple of $1,000s and a laptop and a digital camera and a small mini cassette recorder and a pad and a pen, and I went. And naive, crazy, scared, but very pissed off. So I was more angry about what was happening and what the government of my country was doing than I was afraid. And so I started going. And then as I started going, one thing after another kept happening right at the right times. Like, for example, I'm sitting in Amman, Jordan, and I delayed my trip going in because the hotel I was going to stay at, the Al Fanar, was right across from the Palestine hotel. And resistance fighters had pulled a donkey cart in with a bunch of rockets and shot 17 rockets into the Palestine hotel. And so I thought, I don't think I want to stay right across the street from that. So I stayed. It took me a few days to kind of find a different place to stay. And while I was sitting there on a computer in the hotel, next to me was James Longley, a filmmaker who put out the amazing film Iraq in Fragments that was nominated for an Academy Award last year. And we started talking. He was coming out of Iraq for a break. And he said, well, if you're going in, you're probably going to need an interpreter. Why don't you use mine? I'm taking off for a month. So that's how I found my first interpreter. And it was one thing after another like that that just kept happening along the way. And I had no intention of working as a journalist. I was just going to write reports. I was sending them back to 130 people, mostly in Alaska, at the end of each day. And then by the end of that trip, I started to actually get sought out and picked up to do some stringing for BBC World Service and New Standard News website. And then that's how I ended up going back. The second trip was as a correspondent for New Standard News. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, two questions. It says in the book that you write that one of your great-grandparents was Arab, and so I was sort of curious, as being part Arab, whether that you can see what's going on from a different viewpoint than most Americans do. And second, so much of what you describe sounds like the collective punishment against the Palestinians, which leads me to ask, do they want to depopulate Iraq? I mean, what is the real goal of doing such brutal tactics?
First question is, does having any Arab blood grant me a little bit of a different perspective or assist me in any way? And I was born and raised in Houston, Texas. I'm fourth generation Lebanese on my father's side of the family, hence my name, Dahr Jamail. My mom's German-Irish. My middle name's Kelly. My parents and grandparents both grew up in Houston. I'm a classic, typical American mutt. And I always wanted to go to the Middle East. I'd never been there, but that's about as far as my Arab blood worked, as far as giving me a different perspective, I guess. And as far as the collective punishment, it does very closely resemble Israeli tactics because, as many people here probably know, Rumsfeld basically was the one that drew the plans for this war. That's why they went in with so few troops. That's why they went in when they did and how they did. His whole model of revolutionizing the U.S. military to make it fast and light. We're just going to shock in there and take off the head of the dictator and put on a new head, and then, blast in our neoliberal economic policies and eviscerate the country. And that was the plan. That was the Pax Americana, Project for the New American Century plan for Iraq. And Iraq was the model that was going to spread through the Middle East. But instead, we had a situation where instead of that happening, the 3-4 months into the occupation, and instead of those military people being greeted by roses, as I think Rumsfeld really believed would happen, I really do think he believed that. And once they saw about 3 or 4 months into it that, oh, whoops, there's a resistance. People don't actually like to have their country occupied, especially when those people are doing bad things a lot of the time. So resistance started picking up speed. So around late early fall 2003, Fort Bragg had some visitors from the Israeli military. They had counterinsurgency experts from the Israeli military come over to Fort Bragg and start training. And immediately on the ground, that translated in Iraq to collective punishment. Things like when a U.S. patrol was attacked, like in Samarra, like I spoke of, the whole city would be enraged because all the electricity and water for the whole city would be cut for days, sometimes weeks. This was happening in Ramadi, Samarra, Fallujah, all around places in central Iraq, even parts of Baghdad early on in the occupation. That was happening in Samarra when I was there, from that part that I read. Things like when a U.S. patrol was attacked, if any of the houses nearby, right where the roadside bomb went off, they'd come back with bulldozers and just level the houses. That was policy. The checkpoints set up around Fallujah with using dogs and X-ray equipment and biometric identification like retina scans and fingerprints and ID cards. All of this is taking pages from the masters of occupation. And so these have been being applied in Iraq for ages. And of course, it's done nothing but infuriate people. And that's why we have the resistance the way it is today. And as far as how many people are dead and how many are leaving the country, and that it is becoming divided along sectarian and ethnic lines, it is a deliberate policy. And I want to point directly to the death squads. And I want to just, at the risk of rambling, and hopefully I'll take other questions that are coming, because I think one of the most important questions that has been coming up and I think needs to be addressed is this idea that, well, if the U.S. leaves Iraq, it's going to get worse. The Shia and the Sunni will really start going at it then if the U.S. leaves. And that's basically the dominant rhetoric of, for example, the three leading so-called Democratic presidential candidates, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, John Edwards. And it's extremely racist and ignorant to think that basically the message is, well, if the Great White Hope leaves, then the brown people with the rags on their heads are just going to kill each other even worse. And that's basically the message that they're sending, and that's basically the message that a lot of people in the United States, including a lot of people in the mainstream anti-war movement, are buying. And the reality is, Iraq, this is a place where Western civilization began. There's never been a history of civil war between the Shia and Sunni. Iraqis never identified themselves as Shia or Sunni. And for example, I want to talk about how there's been a deliberate divide and conquer strategy in Iraq from the very beginning. I had a friend from Bakuba, a religious Friday speaker at a mosque, and he's in the book, Sheikh Adnan. He's dead now. And he told me that 3 weeks into the occupation, U.S. military commander came to Bakuba and said, okay, we're going to have a meeting of all the religious and tribal leaders of the city. And so everyone showed up in a big tent, and they literally said, okay, Shia are going to sit over here, and Sunni are going to sit over here. And he said, we all just looked at each other. We never identified ourselves that way. Bakuba is a very mixed city. They pray together in each other's mosques, etc. And then immediately after that, the U.S. sets up the first Iraqi puppet government, the Iraqi Governing Council, 25 members, specifically along sectarian and ethnic lines. So 60% of the population of Iraq is Shia, 60% of the IGC is Shia, 20% Sunni, 20% Sunni, 20% Kurd, throw in a couple of Turkmen, a Christian, and a couple of ladies so it looks somewhat respectable for the media, call it good. People like Ahmed Chalabi was in the IGC. This is a man, a convicted felon in Jordan for embezzling $250 million from the Bank of Petra and only escaping jail by being smuggled out of the country in a trunk of a car. So he's in the IGC, and now he has another prominent position in the government today, I should add. I digress. So the IGC immediately starts getting Iraqis thinking along sectarian and ethnic lines, creating power struggles. But the key point I want to make about the situation with civil war today and why it will get exponentially better when the U.S. leaves is the death squads. And if we go back, I want to go back first for context for this. In Central America, in Honduras, Ronald Reagan's ambassador to Honduras was John Negroponte from 1981 to 1985. War criminal, well documented, set up and ran right-wing death squads. with the assistance of a man named Colonel James Steele. Set up the paramilitary forces, armed them, funded them, ordered them. Fast forward to Baghdad, it's November '04, U.S. invades Fallujah, spreads the resistance all across the country, becomes very quickly apparent, whoops, we need to do another plan, so they come up with the idea of death squads to target the leadership of the Sunni resistance. Who is the U.S. ambassador to Iraq in Baghdad at that time? John Negroponte. Retired Colonel James Steele is there, and his title is Counselor for Iraqi Security Forces. Pulling people from the Shia Badr organization militia, the Kurdish Peshmerga militia, getting them organized, running them all through the Ministry of Interior, as is being done today, and sending them out to target the Sunni leadership of the resistance and key sympathizers. So that started on a broad scale, institutionalized civil war. Being run and orchestrated by the U.S. Of course, it's spun completely out of control at this point. It's become the leading cause of death in Iraq. So the point is, when the U.S. pulls out, and they will eventually have to pull out of Iraq, when they pull out, the key ingredient of the civil war, the key factor causing all the chaos and instability in the country will be removed. And there is already enough political organization resistance in the country there right now, coalition groups together, ready to step in and have real popular elections to bring in a government that would have real popular support.
So my question is, as far as like journalism always goes, it seems that there's an effort to be objective and not get involved in what you're seeing. And I just wondered how you dealt with that, particularly what you read today about being at that clinic. Like what level of participation or objectivity you're trying to do?
The idea of objective journalism was another thing I had to kind of unlearn through my political education after coming out of public schools and the history books that I was given to use. Objective journalism, first we have to go back to the fact that there was no such idea of objective journalism or the idea of professional journalism until corporations started buying up the media. Corporate conglomerates started buying up. I mean, remember back in big cities across the U.S., there used to be lots and lots of different newspapers. There was a business paper, there was a sports paper, there was a lifestyles paper, there was union papers, labor papers, I mean, you name it. And so now we basically have one newspaper, and everything's under one roof. It's like the Walmartization of the news. And so instead of having all these different journalists with their own specialties and their own chosen things that they're going to cover on a regular basis, you have one journalist that has to wear all these hats. And so basically we have to make this little idea that, okay, we can't afford all these other guys, and so you're going to be objective, you're not going to have feelings, they're not going to come out in the story, you're going to report, there's going to be two sides of a story, as if there's only ever two sides of a story. And if you give two viewpoints over here, you have to give two viewpoints over here. My point is, it's completely ridiculous. The second you decide what story, the second I decide what story I'm going to write about, there goes my objectivity, because that means I'm not choosing all these other stories. The second I choose what outlet to report for, there goes my objectivity. Why didn't I report for all these other ones? Is embedded journalism objective? But if you listen, basically the accepted norm today in the United States is that, and particularly in the corporate media, is if you support the administration, and if you're not critical, and if you don't ask the tough questions, and if you support the war, you're objective. And if you ask the tough questions and you oppose it and you're critical, then you're considered biased. And that's basically the message in the mainstream media. And that's why people like me don't get on there, because I'm labeled biased, just like people like Jeremy Scahill that, if he's lucky, gets a little window of 5 minutes on CNN, etc., that we're basically largely censored from the media, because by their definitions, we are biased. And we're all biased. When a journalist goes and embeds, yes, that's a great way to cover what that unit's doing at that specific time. The reality is the embed program was set up by the Pentagon during the '91 Gulf War as a means of information control, and it has worked spectacularly for them. You have journalists in the U.S. particularly falling over themselves to embed, and they couldn't have invented a better propaganda campaign. Why do, you know, I was asked the other day, well, is there still planting of false news stories in the U.S. by groups like Lincoln Group and SAIC and all that? I said, yes, there are, but they don't really, they spend most of their money in Iraq because they don't need to spend it here, because they have journalists falling all over themselves to report on what anonymous Bush administration officials are saying, and that's considered objective journalism. So I think you get my feelings about that. Okay, over here.
Tell us what you saw about what you saw, not the report you heard. Please tell us some of what you saw about interaction between American troops and civilians. What did you see? How did you see the interaction between the U.S. ground troops and the people there? I'd love to know some of that.
Interactions between U.S. troops and Iraqi civilians. It happened in the first 6-8 months of the occupation, where troops were still believing this hearts and mind thing, and they were trying to go out and talk with people. But basically, it hit a point rather quickly once the resistance started and troops quit leaving their vehicles. And so basically this we-they mentality deepened, and they, of course, are riding down the streets in their vehicles with their armor and their shades and their baklavas and their helmets, and basically you can't even see a human being in there. And that's how Iraqis saw them, is like, look, they don't even try to talk to us, they're afraid, they stay in their vehicles. And so any connection or any interaction was largely lost probably 9 months into the occupation. But what I saw was mixed. I mean, I saw, going through checkpoints, I saw some soldiers naturally treating Iraqis with dignity and respect, and I saw others saying, you know, get the fuck away from me, and aiming their guns at them and kicking them and spitting on them and throwing them on the ground and putting bags over their heads and torturing. And I didn't see it, but then, of course, the rampant torture. So it's mixed. I mean, you know, just all soldiers are doing the best they can, but then over time, once they started getting attacked on the levels that they were, that it basically eliminated any possibility of them going in and trying to just talk with Iraqis, especially once suicide bombings really cranked up. Yeah, in the back.
Yeah, thank you for coming. I'm assuming that maybe you can, just nod one, that the death squads include the mercenaries or Armenian mercenaries. Whether or not they do, I don't think American people support the mercenaries. And I think we need to reframe the debate. So I know a lot of us have thought about this. But when somebody says support the troops, I think support America. Because America is a lot broader, and it includes the people, the values that we have in our country. A subset is the troops. The other thing is I'm not seeing what's happening with the fact that all of the presidents except Bush, just about almost unanimously, were against preventive war. In fact, I remember Truman saying that preventive war is only something that a mad dictator would do, that it is not what a democracy does. And I don't know why people and our leaders are not saying that. We need to say this fast. There's another war on the horizon. And I haven't heard this kind of information coming out from people. Ike said the same thing, and even JFK. They said he did not do preventive war. He stopped short of that. The United Nations, when they formed after the First World War II, also was to stop preventive war. So that preemptive and preventive, both. There's a real good book, Less Safe, Less Free, that's out there about this. So I'm hoping we can talk about that, because those are the kind of things. And also, as far as you, I haven't heard in the book, like Scott Ritter and many other people who did, before the war, who told us the truth, who said the fact that they had no weapons of mass destruction, and he had been there along with the UN to look at this. So what I'm wondering is, are we, can we look at those things, and can we also, and I know this is way too much, but the immigration, the immigrants are being attacked in the same way as we are, as the Iraqis are being attacked. So what can we do to reframe the debate and reframe it rather fast, so that people like Pelosi either lead, follow, or get out of the way?
you know, I try not to look at really the big picture. Personally, I think our entire political system is completely corrupt, and you cannot... We're in late capitalism. This, you know, it's basically collapsing around us as we live here. It's like the media. It's going down. You know, mainstream opinion already, even regarding the upcoming election, is, you know, what's the point? Who's even going to vote? I think it's not about reframing debates or, you know, trying to get Pelosi to go one direction or another. I mean, they're all bought and paid for by the same people. It just doesn't matter. I think the answer is just, that's why to me it's locally finding these small groups, whether they're ones that already exist in your community, groups like Vets for Peace and Iraq Veterans Against the War, those groups that can actually literally, tangibly make the war stop because they're not going to fight it anymore. Supporting that, supporting groups that are doing similar type things on different issues here. I mean, I think that's what it's about, and let the big picture go wherever the big picture is going to go. Okay, one more in the very back, and then I'm way beyond my allotted time. Yeah, go ahead.
I just have two questions. One, are people afraid to talk to you in Iraq? Are they afraid for their safety to talk to you? And my other question, and I apologize for this, but it's a personal question, because it's happened to me a little bit as a gardener. Do you have problems in air conditioning?
I haven't had any problems at all here. I'm blacklisted by the U.S. military. I couldn't embed if I wanted to. Big loss. But I know they read everything I write. I wrote that story about the Iraq war vets, and they're going after one of them now, actually. But he's got some good lawyers behind him, we can say that. And I think they're going to back off if they realize what kind of media shitstorm they'll bring on themselves if they do that. Just like what happened with Watada. So the other... Well, I'm sorry, what was your first question?
People were afraid for their safety to be seen talking to you or talking to a journalist.
It got to a point, I haven't been back to Iraq since February '05. I've continued to cover it by working with a couple of my colleagues that are still in there, Iraqi journalists. When I left Iraq in February '05, it got to a point where I knew I wouldn't be coming back anytime soon, because basically there's over 30 people a day in Baghdad alone being kidnapped right now. And it's probably even more than that. And it's because there were these floating checkpoints being set up. So just going around as a journalist in a car, literally you're driving down the street and you see there's these plainclothes people wearing with Kalashnikovs. Maybe they'll throw a few tires out there, like a makeshift checkpoint. You don't know who they are. Are they plainclothes Iraqi police? Are they militiamen? Are they death squad people? Are they just criminals? Whatever. And so you have to turn around literally in the road and try to find a different way to get to where you're going to go. And there was just more and more of these checkpoints popping up, and it just hit a point where it's like, look, the walls are closing in. How much longer can you do that? And along with that is Iraqis did become very wary of talking with people. You know, one of the key symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder is paranoia, and you can't be in that pressure cooker, whether you're a journalist or an Iraqi or a U.S. soldier, and not start feeling that. And so Iraqis, any Westerner that shows up, you're CIA, or you're with the coalition, or you're a mercenary. And so yeah, it did get a lot harder to find people that would talk with me. My first trip, I could walk down the street and talk to anybody I wanted to. I took taxis by myself. I went out to eat. Last trip, cut off my long hair from my climbing days, grow a beard, sneak out of the hotel, go to preset interviews with people that my interpreter had already cleared me with. I mean, that was the situation to operate in. And that's why today we're left in a position where Iraqi journalists and Arab media outlets are the primary source of information coming out of Iraq. And U.S. media, of course, won't rely on that because of its racist nature, that the brown people certainly couldn't be reporting on this the way they ought to. But that's what we have to rely on, and they're consistently doing the best reporting out of Iraq. And so I urge, as we get ready to head out, I think I'm going to sit up here and sign some books, but I encourage everyone, stay informed on what's going on in Iraq. I've got a website. It's just dahr.org, dahr.org. It's got a big link section with a lot of those alternative ways to get information, and stay tuned with what's going on. And thank everyone very much for coming out, and I hope to come back.
You've been listening to Dahr Jamail speaking about his recently published book, Beyond the Green Zone, Dispatches from an Unembedded Journalist in Occupied Iraq. This program was produced by pdxjustice Media Productions. To find out more about this program and related topics, please visit our website at www.pdxjustice.org. You'll find links to websites for more background on the topics discussed in this program, and you'll find presentations by speakers such as Susan Faludi, P. Synoth, David Cole, Jonathan Kozol, Noam Chomsky, Rashid Khalidi, Phyllis Bennis, and many others. Thanks for listening, and thanks for supporting listener-sponsored radio, public access cable television, net neutrality, and all forms of grassroots, democratic, community media.
Thanks very much, everyone, for coming out, and a big thank you to PALS for hosting this and being so supportive of my book. It's really an honor for me to be here. I've never lived in Portland or spent a lot of time here, but I have been through here in the past and wandered the labyrinth of PALS. So it's really means a lot to me to get to be up here tonight. I'm going to talk a little bit about why I went to Iraq, which is how this book was born. And I'll have a question and answer session and read some from the book along the way as well. I want to start in more present tense, though, and begin by talking about one of the recent generals in what's now become a long string of generals who have retired, and then incredibly, after they retire from serving in whatever positions of supporting and running this illegal, immoral war and occupation, once they retire, this interesting phenomena happens. It seems as though their testicles drop. So the individual with his newfound testicles I'd like to start with is a former top U.S. general who was the CENTCOM commander. CENTCOM is Central Command, the U.S. headquarters for the military in the Middle East in Doha, Qatar. And former CENTCOM Commander General John Abizaid, speaking at Stanford University, where he's now a member of the Hoover Institute there, which many people probably are familiar with that. Big shocker. He was speaking there the middle of last month about the Iraq War, and he said, quote, "Of course it's about oil. We can't really deny that." He went on to say, "We've treated the Arab world as a collection of big gas stations. Our message to them is, guys, keep your pumps open, price is low, be nice to the Israelis, and you can do whatever you want out back." He said on October the 31st, more recently, speaking at Carnegie Mellon University, that it may well be 50 years before the U.S. leaves the Middle East. It was roughly a month after, before he had made that first comment, that even the former Federal Reserve of maybe 2 or 3 resistance fighters, and then they fled, as they usually do, as is the nature of guerrilla war, and then the military patrol basically went berserk and started shooting up downtown Samarra, and these are the 8 civilians that were killed. 2 of them were Iranian pilgrims, because once the borders opened up after Saddam was removed, the Shrine of Al-Askari is in Samarra, otherwise known as the Golden Mosque, which was exploded in February '06. The 2 Iranian pilgrims were visiting this very sacred Shia shrine, and then the other 6 bodies were residents from Samarra. And an interesting thing happened then. We went and interviewed a leading tribal leader in the area, and he said the same story. He said, if there are all these bodies, as the military claims, let's see them. If there's 54 dead at Fedayeen, where did they go? Where are the bodies? Did the Americans take them in their tanks? Are they flying? Just show us the bodies. And so after interviewing him, we decided to go down to the scene of the attack in downtown Samarra. And to give you an idea of how dangerous the situation became for journalists as a direct result of the corporate media propaganda efforts, the scene was already set when we arrived, so that what had happened was a day or two before we got there, there were some mainstream journalists that showed up with their news cameras, BBC, NBC, and I think a couple of others, and they interviewed people, put them on tape, filmed them, and then went back to Baghdad, and instead of showing any of that footage, they just regurgitated the military side of the story. So it was a loaded situation when we showed up, and it made it that much more dangerous for us. And so when we started talking to people, needless to say, they were very, very upset at us for being there, and that's the context for this first bit that I'd like to read you. We were surrounded by throngs of nervous and very angry Samarra residents when we revisited the scene of the attack. A rusty old taxi driving by slowed, and a man yelled at us out the window. "All the media is not telling the truth. They are lying, all of them. Don't talk to them. I did so many interviews with the media, and nobody is telling my truth. Nobody has reported what I told them. Why should you even talk to them? They are lying all the time, so don't talk to them." I stood near a building riddled with bullets and spoke with people who crowded around, anxiously waiting to tell their story. Shell casings littered the ground near the wall of a home. A man in his early 40s exclaimed with his hands in the air, "If the Americans can shoot every child walking in the street, it means the end of this planet." In just 1 week, I had already become familiar with the hands-in-air gesture made by frustrated and shocked Iraqis. To me, it signified the despair that was spreading across the country, a plea to anything or anyone who would listen. Another man showed me a parked car. Scarf Chair Alan Greenspan wrote, quote, "The Iraq War is largely about oil." So here we are approaching the 5th year anniversary of the invasion, and it's become commonplace now, almost in vogue, for retired generals, retired administration officials to come out and denounce the occupation or be critical of it, at least to the extent of discussing how it should be run differently, etc. I want to back up now to the time period when the propaganda campaign for the invasion was launched. I want to take us back to September 6, 2002. Then the White House Chief of Staff, Andrew Card, when speaking about the PR campaign for the Iraq War, told reporters, quote, "From a marketing point of view, you don't introduce new products in August." And with few exceptions, I really didn't hear any mainstream media critique, dissent, asking questions like, is it really appropriate for a White House Chief of Staff to be discussing PR campaigns and war in the same sentence? I was outraged. I think probably most people in this room tonight were outraged. And it was really because this was just the very beginning. It got worse, because launching a PR campaign for war is exactly what Andrew Card did. And as I move through this, think about present tense. This September, a different PR campaign for a new war was also launched with staunch backing from the American Heritage Foundation, a neoconservative think tank, and here we are today with the rhetoric continuing, but I'll get back to that a little bit later. So that was on September 6th when Andrew Card said that. The very next day, on September 7th, George Bush and Tony Blair stood together at Camp David and declared that they had evidence from a report published by the UN International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, that showed that Iraq was 6 months away from building nuclear weapons. What made it particularly outrageous was the fact that no such IAEA report existed. And again, where was the corporate media? Where were the journalists that were asking Mr. Bush or Mr. Blair, some of their underlings, to provide that IAEA report or any other evidence that would support their claims of Iraq about to get nuclear weapons or already having WMDs, links to 9/11, etc. Where were the journalists? Where were the hard questions? And again, with very, very few exceptions in the mainstream, they weren't there. Instead, they were just announcing these claims without questioning, which is not journalism, that's propaganda. The very next day, instead of, if journalists were really doing their job, the next day on the leading newspapers, the cover story should have been Bush and Blair make preposterous, baseless claim with no evidence of an IAEA report that does not exist. If journalists were really doing their job, that should have been the lead story. Instead, the very next day, September 8, 2002, the cover story, the front page story on the New York Times, co-authored by Judith Miller and Michael Gordon of WMD notoriety, Michael Gordon still working for the Times, of course, in which they proudly quoted their favorite sources. This one, a Bush administration official, anonymous of course, as saying, quote, "Iraq has stepped up its quest for nuclear weapons and has embarked on a worldwide hunt for materials to make an atomic bomb." And again, no questioning whatsoever of where's the evidence, let's have the hard evidence, show us something. If you're going to take the country into war against another country, things like evidence would be particularly important. But again, it wasn't there. And I was completely outraged and simultaneously baffled that, with few exceptions again, the corporate media was silenced instead of doing the job as journalists should do and asking the hard questions. Instead, it was, as journalist John Pilger has described that situation, along with others, instead of being real journalism, what the mainstream media was doing was propaganda disguised as journalism. So for me, that was my red line. I was living in Anchorage, Alaska. I was working summers up on Denali, guiding and then volunteering doing rescues for the National Park Service up there. And I've always loved to write. I'd done some freelance journalism, but for me, I figured, you know, that's if we're going to be taken into a war, and if this is the state of our media today, then something has to be done. And I didn't know what else to do. I was frustrated. I was completely outraged. I wasn't sleeping well once the war launched. I was glued to foreign media to find out what was happening, what was being done. And I decided one thing I could do was I could go over and see for myself what was happening, and I could write about that. So I went over to Iraq. I saved a couple of $1,000s. And I'm just sharing this story because I'm not a professional journalist. I didn't go to J school, all the stuff that you're supposed to do to become a so-called professional journalist. And I share all this because if anyone here thinks you can't make a difference, think again. So I went into Iraq my first trip on, I got there November 24th, 2003, so about 7 months after the fall of Baghdad. And I hit the ground, and within 72 hours I was hearing stories of torture, not just from Abu Ghraib, but from military detention facilities in the north of Baghdad, down in the south, industrial scale torture as policy. Stories, again, not just from Abu Ghraib, but sexual humiliation, dogs being used, electricity, sleep deprivation, etc. And I was on the ground 72 hours, and I was hearing these stories all over the streets of Baghdad. But on my 5th day there, on November 29th, up in Samarra, I heard of another story that perked my interest as well. And the U.S. military announced that they had a patrol in downtown Samarra that came under attack from a huge contingent of Saddam's Fedayeen. Saddam's Fedayeen were basically his shock troops, his special forces. And the military claim seemed odd because there had never up until that date, nor has there been ever after that date, been a uniform, organized contingent of his military launch an attack on any of the occupation forces, or anyone else for that matter. So it smelled. And it smelled even more because the military claimed that the patrol came under attack, they fought back valiantly, and they killed 48 Fedayeen. And then overnight, another report came out the next day that said the number was 54 killed, not 48. And again, there was no evidence given for this whatsoever. So it seemed really peculiar. So a couple of friends and I and an interpreter took a car up to Samara, about an hour and a half north of Baghdad. And it made sense to us that, well, evidence is important, and if the military is going to make this claim, there must be a lot of bodies in the morgue. So we went to Samara General Hospital and spoke with doctors, spoke with wounded people there. There were many wounded people from gunshot wounds in the hospital. And we went to the mortician, and we were shown 8 bodies, and they were all civilians. And the stories that the doctors told us and everyone that we interviewed in the hospital beds, from little kids on up to men to women, the story was that a U.S. patrol was in downtown Samara. It was attacked by a group